Hi, I'm M.
And my name is Bea.
And this is
Fangirls Anonymous. A quick warning, this podcast is not for kids.
We get into some pretty explicit stuff.
But if you're still with us and into that, welcome.
Bea!
I am.
Hi, Bea. How's it going?
It's going pretty good. How about yourself?
I'm really good. This week's been pretty fun.
I've had a good week too. I feel like I say this every time, but work has been going great. I'm excited to talk about this topic.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah. I've been excited to talk about crack for a while now. Just because it's something that I didn't necessarily know about before we started doing this as much, because I'm not a crack reader.
Mm-hmm.
So, the cat's out of the bag pretty early this episode.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about crackfic, and
which is different than the slang term for cocaine, I believe. We're not talking about that. If you want to talk about that, you should go somewhere else.
Yeah. So, what is your experience with crack, Bea?
My experience is that I don't read a ton of it, but that it's very distinctive. It's something that you know when you see, and there's good and there's bad.
Like anything, I'd say.
In this case, they're pretty extreme, good and bad. I don't think I've ever come across a mediocre crackfic.
I laugh because that just doesn't sound like it could be possibly a thing for some reason.
Not if you're doing crack the way it was intended to be written.
Yeah, like crack is so out there that you would have to try really hard to make it mediocre.
Yeah.
It's either going to be very bad or it's either going to be very good. As we will be talking about with a specific fic that I think most of you listening know about, and if you don't, oh boy, buckle up, buckaroos. With my history with crack, I don't read it. I have really, really terrible secondhand embarrassment. And if I'm reading a fic that makes me embarrassed in any way for the characters or the author or anything like that, and that is usually involved with crack, I have found, I just can't do it. There's like a saying from, like, I think it's from Sweden, but I could be wrong, where it's like second room embarrassment, where you're watching a TV show or you're at like a friend's house and you're seeing an argument between your friend and their parents or something like that. You have to be in the second room watching or like listening, like you have to be in a different space in order to experience this embarrassment, and that's me. That is so me. So anyway, yeah, we maybe are not like we're not the best examples of people who read crack, because we aren't.
And
people who read crack.
Maybe we're missing out on something that everybody else that reads it is like, no, this is the purpose of it, which, we'd love to hear about anybody who's like, hey, this is why crack is awesome and you should read more of it. But I guess y'all are stuck with us for the moment.
Yeah, this is kind of just a conversation between two people who don't know anything about crack, and we're talking about crack. We know a little bit. I mean, when you're involved in fan fiction and fandom and all that jazz, you learn about things on the periphery of that, and crack tends to be on the periphery. Okay, so there are two meanings to crack. They're both playing off of the slang for crack cocaine a little bit. I didn't know that there were two meanings.
I didn't either.
Yeah, there's one that we tend to assume when we're saying the word crack, but there's another one that is interesting. The first one is that it's highly addictive, which is the one I didn't know about.
Same.
Yeah, which I guess is understandable. I make a candy every holiday season in December that we call Christmas crack, even though I don't celebrate Christmas, because it's really highly addictive candy. So I kind of understand that. Maybe I shouldn't be doing that, because there are a lot of people who are addicted to crack cocaine, and that's not good. But
yeah, that first definition I hadn't known about either, and I guess it follows. If you had put before me a sentence that had that usage, I would have made sense to me. But it is a lot more general. I feel like that touches into some more broad spectrum culture usage than fandom specific, so that's not what I think of when I think crackfic.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Like, you could say, like, that TV show is crack,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not necessarily part of fan fiction or fandom. So, this is the other definition for crack. Crack can describe fan works with a fundamentally ludicrous premise or otherwise including a plethora of unbelievable, incredible, or just plain silly elements. That is, implying the author/artist must have been on drugs to produce something so insane. It may be used in a compound noun, crackfic, or an adjective, crack pairing. On Tumblr, posts in the vein of crack may be labeled as crack post. This is the one that I tended to use in my head when I was thinking about crack with fanfic, except for the concept that to say something is crack is implying that the author/artist must have been on drugs to produce something so insane. I still, even that part of the definition I didn't know about.
I did assume that's where it came from, that it was meant to imply that's the sort of thing that you're getting into. Once you've read Alice in Wonderland and you are familiar that sometimes people just assume that authors were on drugs when they wrote something, that if you read something written as crack or crack fic, you're like, that's what they're talking about, at least for me.
Yeah, I guess I just did not extrapolate from that. But you're right. So, we're talking about crack, but we are not talking about badfic when we're talking about crack. So there's another term called badfic, and it's different. It's defined as fan fiction that is very badly written, characterized, structured, or all of the above. It can refer to fic written badly by accident, or fic written badly on purpose for amusement.
Which I think a good reason for this distinction, if you've ever run across either one of them, is badfic and crackfic can both sometimes read as almost nonsensical, like there isn't a causal chain to follow. But in badfic, it's either obviously on accident or on purpose done that to display that it is a badly written story, as opposed to crackfic, where it generally is done exclusively as a humor thing. The fact that it is also nonsensical and absurd is secondary to the fact that they're trying to be as ridiculous as possible.
I would say that the best example of bad fic is the fic My Immortal. It is well known, even outside of fan fiction circles, I'd say. There have been Vox articles on My Immortal. I wish that it didn't have so much press surrounding it because it makes a lot of people, I'd assume, who are not in fan fiction think badly about fan fiction because that's like the only thing they know about it, you know?
Well, there is one other thing they know about it.
And that is?
50 Shades of Grey used to be a Twilight fanfiction, which also doesn't cast a great light.
You're right. We're trying to change that. That's one of our values as a podcast, to try and change the concept that all fanfic is crack or all fanfic is dumb or not written well, and that's ridiculous. There are whole ass novels that are amazing written by fanfiction authors for fandoms. Anyway, I'm preaching to the choir. So My Immortal, I couldn't even read through the summary of it on Wikipedia. Don't read it if you don't want to, but it is an experience that I have read. Like, I haven't read it, but it's an experience. I've read that other people have experienced it, and they say it's an experience. So, yeah, it's a bad fic, and it's considered cracky, but that kind of taints the name of crack a little bit, in my opinion.
It sometimes feels like if you're thinking about crackfic and badfic, you should think of a Venn diagram. They're two different things, but there is overlap. And there is a fair amount that falls in that overlap.
Perfect illustration. And My Immortal is squarely in the center of those two circles. Anyway, I found this funny answer to a question on the r/fanfiction Reddit thread. The question was, what makes a good crackfic? And the top answer was by TARDISfly. I find there has to be a good hook and premise. If the reader is not 110% on board from the start, it's hard to keep going. The outlandish story, not characters, not ships, makes the crack fic. Like my favorite crack fic, Harry being raised by the Rock rather than the Dursleys. I just love that so much. Also, I'd argue that even though crack fics are out of character by nature, the author still needs to know the characters' voices in order to hit that narrow strip of funny in between the chasms of and hell no. And I really liked that response because as somebody who doesn't really read crackfic, I've always kind of wondered why people read it. uh,
Yeah. And I would agree that if you don't get hooked by the idea pretty quick in a crack fic, you're unlikely to read it. But also, if the hook itself ends up being inconsequential, like you have two chapters that are what you thought they were, and then due to the nature of crackfic, it takes a wild right turn and goes somewhere else and you never look back, it's also pretty hard to keep going because whatever you may have been interested in gets left by the wayside.
yeah, I mean, one of my favorite fan fictions of all time is still going, and it's called Harry Omens, which is Harry being raised by Aziraphale and Crowley from the Good Omens universe. And I am now fascinated by Harry being raised by the Rock. I want that. I need to read it right now, but it'll be like the first crackfic I've ever read because I'm not into it, and that's okay. But if you are into it, please email us at mmbpresents@gmail.com to tell us
Mm-hmm.
why you love crackfic, because we would love to hear from you. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting hearing from people online about why
Mm-hmm.
they like crack.
I know for myself, the few things that I have read that are crack, I can think of one specific one that I'm like, this is for sure crack. I think even the author would agree that it's crack. And it's called Rebellion by Tatra Megami. And it's another Harry Potter fic. And the entire premise is that in fifth year, instead of doing any of the things that Harry Potter did, he decides that his plan to get rid of Umbridge and Snape in this particular story is he is going to pretend that he has gone insane and start doing crazy things. And by crazy things, I mean like he makes thousands of rubber ducks float in the Great Hall, or he turns Snape's classroom into a club that serves only apple juice. He spends the entire year handing Snape an apple every single day.
He's finally figured out the exact use of a rubber duck.
Yeah, apparently. And otherwise, the events of the fifth Harry Potter book proceed pretty much in the same fashion, except for the fact that whatever he's doing makes no sense. And it's hilarious.
And you would consider it very crack.
Yeah, because ultimately, nothing really makes sense, and the entire framework of the plot is just the fifth book. So if they were trying to do any character work or explore anything, they really didn't. They just went, okay, let's assume that everything is the same except for all of these ridiculous off the wall funny things that are technically out of character.
But it's still a very fun and
Mhm.
enjoyable experience to read it.
Absolutely. It is one of those things that I keep returning to and rereading because it makes me giggle because the absurdity is so very strange, but at the same time it's very good, clean fun. I mean, there is nothing offensive to be had about a million rubber ducks floating in the Great Hall. They spend a lot of time turning Umbridge's door bright orange and her classroom bright orange, and they stack weird things on her desk like bananas and rolled up socks. And it's just funny because it doesn't really do anything other than confuse everybody.
Including the reader.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds fun. And, I read a lot of angst and a lot of hurt comfort and a lot of,
Mm-hmm.
more serious fics. Maybe I should start getting into crack and enjoy some levity,
Yeah, that's the one that I've read. I have tried to read others that are a lot more random. That I think that's part of my problem with a lot of crack fic is if there is a tenuous thread of a plot for me to follow to get from point A to point B, I'm willing to go along with the nonsense. But if it's literally just X happens and then Y happens and then Z happens and none of it makes sense and none of these things really intersect in a way that they cause other things to happen, there's no causality to it. It sort of bugs me because I'm like, I'm just watching people say things at each other and do things independently of each other. There's not a story here.
Quick question. Do you enjoy modernist music? Like the music that doesn't have a through line? Because I don't.
I'm not even sure what that would be.
Like in orchestral music, there is an era of music that it was very modern, very discordant, doesn't
Mm.
really have motifs. And if it does have a motif, it's not throughout the piece, so therefore it's not really a motif. I know this is a completely different thing to fan fiction, but I was just wondering if there's kind of a correlation between somebody who kind of needs a through line in story, but also in music too, because I'm the same way. If there's no through line in a piece of music or an orchestral piece or a fan fiction, that I just cannot physically make myself read it or listen to it.
I wouldn't know, but that is very
Humans
interesting.
love patterns. It's kind of very artistic to be doing crack. And I know that sounds weird.
I feel like it is a lot of times firmly in the absurdist category of...
Yeah, like postmodern absurdism.
Yeah.
Kind of. Yeah.
Where you're deconstructing the entire idea of what a story is and what humor is, but at the same time, just because I can admire the technique doesn't mean I enjoy the end product.
Yeah, I don't like satire.
I like satire, but...
Well, in what you said, like deconstructing, you know, fan fiction in general, which some people think My Immortal was. Some people think My Immortal was deconstruction / satire fan fiction.
Arguments can be had.
But, I don't know, I think that there's a line at which something becomes absurdist and something becomes entertaining. And I'm always going to try to find the entertaining one and never the absurdist one. And there's a time and a place for admiring something that is absurdist, but it's not a painting I want to leave on my wall that's absurdist, you know? It's not something I like. Okay, and this is going to be a real take. I don't like Picasso.
I don't think that Picasso is technically part of the absurdist movement, but I get the picture.
No, he isn't.
Literally, pun intended.
I'm just not interested in something that weird, and that makes me really basic probably, but I think I'm willing to take a look into crack more after this episode.
I'd also like to point out that, well, I would be very hesitant to say that I've read a lot of crack. I am a lot more likely to read what is usually tagged as crack treated seriously, which is that same idea of this hook, this sort of silly premise, but instead of treating it as humor or going off the deep end or whatever it is you're doing with it, you are treating it as though it is a completely serious premise that you should build up and play all the way to its logical conclusion, as it were. For example, it seems like complete crackfic to write a story about everybody in The Hobbit being werewolves. But if you treat it seriously, you actually have a fairly interesting story premise where you're just like, okay, how would being a werewolf affect the story? And I'm much more likely to read that, but in my own mind, that almost feels like not as much crackfic because it isn't nonsense and it isn't silly. It's just the initial starting premise that's a little bit off the wall.
Yes. There's a reason why certain ideas are considered crack and certain ideas are not. And it has to wholly do with the fandom that the fanfiction is coming from, but also just like the society we live in. A lot of people would consider all fanfiction is crack. Everything is absurd. What do you mean those two men would be together, or those two women would be together, or those two characters would be together? What do you mean? That sounds ridiculous. And by that definition, they would consider that whole ship to be crack. It's kind of crazy. Even society tells you whether something is crack or not, even if you don't know that could be considered crack or not. Okay, so I think we need to talk about whether the concept of crack would be considered, at least within fandom circles, neutral or negative, or even positive in some cases. I don't know. It could be positive.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody's really proud of their fic, but they would consider it pretty cracky, then why can't it be a positive term, you know?
And I also feel like it has to do with the sort of author you are, because if you're an author who's known for humor or for doing lighthearted pieces and you do a crackfic, people are probably going to say that in a positive fashion because they're associating it with your past work and your sense of humor.
Yeah, almost ethos crackfic. Pathos, logos, and ethos. I'm really getting into my degree now from college. Yeah, like if an author is well known and well regarded, then a lot of people are going to end up liking their current fics. And if they tag it as crack, they're going to be like, "Oh my god, Queen! Like, that's amazing! What a cracky fic! I love it." So it could be considered positive in that specific way. But I would say mostly it is a negative or neutral term.
I I'd argue more neutral, because when I encounter it, it usually is said in a very your mileage may vary sort of a way. Just like as a warning, like this is crackfic, and if you like that, go ahead. I would recommend it, but if you don't, then you've been warned.
That's great. I mean, it's a way to tag things and really tell people what's happening. But it also really depends on what that author would consider crack, like everybody having wings. A lot of fandoms would not consider that necessarily crack, but if the author does from that fandom, maybe it turns people away, you know? Like, that sucks. So, okay, a lot of people would claim that it's kind of derogatory term. Or that it was initially meant as a derogatory term.
Yeah.
Like, wow, that writer must have been on crack to have done that. And it's like an awful fic or something like that. Which I think there's a reason why badfic became a thing, so that crackfic could be a different thing.
Yeah, because
I don't know when it became a thing first, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where once you read a little bit of each, you know that there really is a difference, because crackfic can be really well written, even though it is silly, whereas badfic perforce is written quite badly. And I can see how it might have had connotations of sort of being almost dismissive, like this person was just putting down their random crazy 3 a.m. drunken ramblings and therefore they should be dismissed. But I feel like it couldn't have stayed that way, because first of all, sometimes they really are just good fun, even if that is the way they were brought into being. But I feel like if there didn't start out, there must have quickly followed kind of a, I guess, cult following is the best way I can put it, of people who really enjoy reading and writing it, and do so with a degree of skill and persistence that you wouldn't get out of somebody who was just doing it in the middle of a high. So it couldn't have stayed that way for long.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's a whole world unto itself for a reason, I'd say. There's a lot of people who really enjoy stuff that is off the wall crazy. And that's cool. You know, it's very creative, just from what I've read online and heard about. Yeah.
Some of the wackier things I've read have definitely been in things that are either crack or the next best thing too.
Yeah. So that transitions pretty well to the concept of it just being a phrase to be able to be less serious when you're writing fic. Not everything has to be serious. So some people argue that it gives the writer permission to be weird and to be creative and to be not so perfect, I guess. You can kind of, like, I found this quote: the downside is that it's also an excuse to be lazy, but crackfic in the hands of the careless or inexperienced could be a painful, ugly thing. And yeah, there's really a line that a lot of young writers don't necessarily know about when it comes to things like squicks and triggers and that stuff, which we've talked about in past episodes. But yeah, I think it's cool for a writer to just let their hair down and write whatever the fuck they want to write, you know, without worrying what other people are going to think. And I think that is a added benefit to writing crack for authors.
It is, because when you stop worrying about, are they in character, does it make sense for this to enter here, do I have to justify it to myself and to my readers, you know, you can really just be like, and suddenly there was a dragon, and it being a dragon, they of course had to fight it, and you're going, but this was like an anime soccer thing, and you're just like, nope, it's crackfic, doesn't matter, there's a dragon now. But I think a good way to explain the difference between a skillful use of crackfic and a not is if anyone has ever been around a small child trying to tell you a story, and the way that they sort of circle an idea for a long time, where they'll start with, and I was doing this, and we were going on a train, and then there was a tiger, and then we were on top of my house, and they just sort of ping pong around, and you can tell that they have a story going on in there, but you're missing some of the context and the words, and they're not quite skilled enough linguistically to really communicate it, and there also is a little bit of just, they're waiting for something to come out of their own mouth so that they can like bounce off of it. Sometimes in really badly written, clearly inexperienced crackfic, you get a little bit of that, where they kind of circle their own ideas and they're waiting for themselves to generate something, whereas I rarely see that with more experienced writers. They tend to have a pretty clear-cut goal for wherever this is going, even if it makes no sense.
Well, there's also this thing called, or this concept that crack simply refers to an inherent silliness of the topic. So let me actually read this quote that I found. Crackfic is, in my opinion, a matter of premise. Crackfic implies an initial premise that is implausible, if not impossible. A premise that is surrealist, even absurdist. Someone turns into a girl, or a badger, or a penguin, or they sprout wings, or they lay eggs, or get pregnant despite being a man. They get set down in a historical context outside the limits of accepted behavior without being called on it. A man is cast as a schoolmarm, complete with skirts and petticoats. So it's just a way to tell your reader that, hey, this is just kind of silly. and that's it. It doesn't have to be anything more than that. And that's okay.
But I think that comes back to my question that if I like things that I would label crack treated seriously, are they still technically crack, even though they are otherwise attended to with the same level of detail and conciseness as any other story? I
personally don't think so.
That's my feeling as well, but I hesitate to completely divorce it from the trope because it feels like it still has a place there because, like you said, crackfic doesn't have to just be humor, it can be serious, and I almost feel like crack treated seriously, other than the obvious labeling in the tag itself, is that other half that we are not just doing it for kicks, or well, I guess everything in fic is for kicks, but we're not just doing it to make people laugh.
Yeah, I mean, it has to ultimately depend on what is considered weird within the fandom that they're writing the fanfic in, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you're writing in DC, where lots of weird stuff happens all the time, at least from what I understand,
Yeah.
then the fanfic that comes from that fandom is gonna seem really cracky compared to a show like Law and Order fandom, you know?
My knee-jerk reaction was actually Turncoat, but
I don't even know what that is.
that is a TV show about the American Revolution.
No, it's
I've
called
never
Turn.
Turn. Okay.
I'm watching it right now.
I thank you for correcting me. I've never
No,
actually
you're okay.
watched it. Yeah, if you tried to take a DC crack premise and stick it in Turn,
Oh god. First of all, I'm just gonna say Turncoat is a much better name for that show. That's all I'm gonna say about that. But
maybe I briefly inhabited an alternate universe where that was
no,
the
you
truth.
absolutely did. Turncoat is much better. But the show, you're right. Comics, you're allowed to do anything. Comics with superheroes and superpowers and alternate universes and legacies, and it's just a lot of stuff that exists in one universe that can be pulled into anything, right? But with Turn, you're only within the limits of 1777. So unless it's an AU, and even then, I mean, is crack AU? Like
I can't think of a good way to have the box ghost from Danny Phantom occur in that fandom and have it be anything but absurd. Whereas you could probably stick them in DC and make it okay. But you definitely
I miss that
couldn't.
dude. I loved Danny Phantom growing up. Oh my god. Yeah, it's a weird can of worms when you're considering crack involving fandoms. So
and it can be a lot more subtle, I think, in terms of where that line is. I feel like we took two pretty extreme examples.
yeah, we did.
In the middle there, I would say there's Sherlock, which in addition to previously being kind of a mega fandom, so you get a little bit of everything, you could do really weird premises. You just had to do a lot of the world building to convince your audience that it existed in the same universe.
Is alternate universe, could it be considered crack?
That is a question.
I really feel like it could, because I don't know, it really wholeheartedly depends on your definition of what crack is. But I would say that I grew up reading fanfiction, and like ABO, for example, I feel like a lot of people who don't know about it would consider it really cracky, but it's not, like, to me. Maybe it's really personal what crack is.
I feel like there's a certain amount of that, but I also feel like it really is, you know it when you see it. Because if you do a tag search on AO3 for crackfic, you're going to get something very, very different than if you search for humor or a specific trope that could be considered cracky, like wingfic. I've seen wingfic that has been treated very seriously.
Oh my god, yes. There will be an episode soon that we'll be talking about our fics that have taught us something, and there's gonna be an episode or a fic in that episode about that specifically. Like, oh my gosh, and some people consider it cracky for somebody to be taking a group of people with wings so seriously, I guess.
And I've seen it treated that way.
Yeah.
So I guess it's in the eye of the beholder, I suppose, or the eye of the author, because it really depends on how they personally write it.
Yeah. So another thing that people tend to talk about surrounding crack and it being tagged is that fans don't like it when an author pre-labels something so personally perspective-y. That's not a word.
Based
Like
so much
it's
on their own
so
opinion of it.
yeah, exactly. There's a quote, sometimes when an author labels a story crackfic, they're doing the thinking for me, telling me how to judge the story and where to rank it. But I want to do that myself. And it is, I'm sure, about the writer's feelings about their story and their own process while writing it, but it still bugs me to some to be told that I shouldn't be taking this story seriously. What if I do? Does that mean my judgment is off? It's true. Like some people would consider this thing crack, and some people would consider this thing completely normal for the fandom, and some people are in between, and that's okay. Maybe we shouldn't be using the term crack in a way to make people assume that it's bad, but it should
Yeah.
always be a neutral term.
Yeah, my opinion on it is that I try very hard to think about it the way I think it should be viewed, which in my opinion is very much as a neutral, your mileage may vary. You if you want to, you know what it is. If you don't want to, you can avoid it. And other than that, I don't feel like there should be any sort of a judgment placed upon it because like I said, I've read really good crackfic and I've read really bad crackfic. And that goes for the rest of fic as well.
You've read good fic and you've read bad fic. Like, it just depends on what you're interested in and the tagging that the author tags, like how they tag. All of this is so weird, but I think it's important to talk about. I think I need to read this quote that I found because it's going to give us something to talk about that is another can of worms.
Mm.
So, this is it. Some crack premises that were presented as absurd in older fanworks, even if the term crack had not been invented yet, have outlived the original definition. One example is early M/M fanworks, such as Kirk/Spock, in which the very premise was seen as outlandish. Most fans today would also probably avoid labeling or writing a fic where a character turns into a girl as crack. Some early crack premises, such as mpreg, once seen as very rare and outlandish, would likely be used as a trope today. So, even Kirk Spock was considered crack for a while. That is Kirk Spock is like the freaking basis on which all fanworks have been created online, I think. Like, there were fanzines were created for solely Kirk Spock fan fiction and fan art and fan works in general, and were disseminated to people who subscribed physically before the internet existed. It's like, that's crazy to me that was considered crack. But yeah, mpreg is not considered crack, at least in certain fandoms.
And
like mpreg
depending
and
on
Law and Order that's crack to me.
Mhm. And also I think based on what the author is writing the story around. I've read in fandoms where impreg is very much not treated as crack most of the time, but every now and again somebody is just like, I gotta poke fun at this, can't help it. Which, fair.
Steve just gets pregnant all the time.
For those of you who are just now tuning in, that would be Steve Rogers from the Avengers fandom. And yeah, that's a thing.
And a lot of people try to actually like skirt around that with ABO. We will be getting into ABO. Don't you worry.
That's just a huge topic in and of itself.
It is it's a world, it's a universe within a universe, my goodness.
But back to this topic, would you argue then that you could get, I guess I would call it like crackish drift? That you can have premises that are originally quite out there that get reused and then normalized and then folded into the culture of fandom?
They outlive the original definition, absolutely. It has to do with the fandom, obviously. Usually when a TV show or a series of movies goes on for a long time, the stories themselves, the canon itself tends to get a little bit weirder just because the audience need to go to a place, like they need to go different places, So that kind of opens up for more strange fan fiction. because fanfiction tends to go 100 miles an hour when it can, and when it's allowed to through canon, it'll go 200 miles an hour. So it's definitely dependent on the fandom itself and the canon itself. But I will say that society changes, and fanfiction has become more mainstream, which is kind of scary, in my opinion. It's kind of scary in certain ways and also celebratory in other ways, but society changes, fanfiction has become more mainstream. Therefore, a lot of young women, because it is mostly young women who read fanfic and write fanfic, a lot of young women wouldn't bat an eye at Steve getting pregnant anymore. When society changes in that way, when a whole generation of young people they become accustomed to these outlandish ideas, what is even outlandish anymore? It has to do with the story itself becoming outlandish. Like, there's no through line anymore. And I think that's where we are right now. And I think even that will someday become not very outlandish. Like, oh, that's just another one that's absurdist.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be a like one of those sponges in the Antarctic that can revert back into its larval state or whatever. I know that sounded absurdist when I first heard that sentence, but yeah, like, grandfather clocks always tick back. So we might get to a point where, everybody feels like if it's not the up to code or the straight and narrow, it's a ridiculous phrase to use right now, but
if you don't have a very tight plot with good characterization and canon details cited in the bottom in your author's note,
then it's crack. Yeah, exactly. Or it's even badfic, which that would suck. But fanfiction has always been, at least what I can glean, one of the most creative spaces you can be in, and crack is considered too creative for some people. So it's kind of, where does that line end? It's gonna keep getting pushed, and somehow it's gonna have to revert back, I think.
You're saying the pendulum's gonna peak, we're gonna go back the other way?
Yeah, the sponge is gonna get back to its baby state and then grow again.
Awesome.
Yeah. I think that we have talked a lot about crack, and we could keep going, but we would just be circling back. I think we should go to Rec Corner! Do you want to go first?
Okay. My rec this week is called I Once Started Out to Walk Around the World and Ended Up in Brooklyn by Suzukiblu. This is an interesting one because I would consider it at least partially crackish. I'm not entirely sure if the author would. The premise is that Bucky Barnes, in the middle of recovering from being the Winter Soldier right after the events of the movie The Winter Soldier, runs into Darcy Lewis from the Thor movies. Darcy Lewis, at least initially, doesn't have any idea who the Winter Soldier is, and just sort of sees what she considers to be a handsome hobo, and picks him up and takes him away, and ends up making him her intern in Jane's lab. The reason that it's sort of crackish is because things get sillier from there, where he was this world-class assassin and he's like, what is my mission? How do I be an intern so that I can stay here? And she's like, you gotta know how to make Pop-Tarts. And he's like, I will learn how to make Pop-Tarts. And she's like, the ones with sprinkles are really good. And he's like, must find all of the sprinkle Pop-Tarts.
That's adorable.
And then Thor ends up showing up, and he has the biggest crush on Thor, but he has no way to process this. So he just sort of gets in these very silly situations because Thor also doesn't really understand how to human being at all. And so you've got someone who's recovering from being brainwashed and somebody who's sort of acclimatizing to humanity, and them meeting in the middle. And then eventually there is Steve trying to find Bucky, going, what is going on?
Now I think about it, Thor is kind of the alien version of Steve. My rec for the episode is LukeWarm by DarkisRising. It is not a crack fic. I just don't read crack. But it is a canon-compliant fic somewhat. The summary is, the Jedi is sick. This much is clear. It's a very short summary. It is a sick fic. Luke gets a pretty bad cold/flu thing, and Din has to take care of him. It's only 7K. It's very sweet. I'm just gonna say it. Probably every episode. I'm a whore for hurt comfort. So please, if you want to read it, it's really cute. DarkisRising has other good Din Luke fics too, so go ahead and look look at that. They have a lot of shorter fics. So I know I tend to rec really long fics. I'm trying to not do that anymore because some people just do not have time. But 7K is doable. It's probably like 30 to 40 minute read. Anyway, that's it. That was fun. That was a romp through crack.
I guess we'll see y'all next week
On Fangirls Anonymous. Bye!